Captain Thornton's voice cut across the memorial plaza like a blade. His finger jabbed toward the old woman's chest, toward the faded navy jacket hanging loose on her thin frame. Take it off. Now. You are not fooling anyone with that stolen property. The woman did not move. Her hands, weathered and scarred across the knuckles, stayed perfectly still at her sides. What Thornton did not know, what nobody standing in that plaza knew, was that the woman wearing that jacket was the reason a Soviet submarine never launched its missiles in 1983. And in exactly 15 minutes, the captain's career would be over. The morning had started quietly for Eleanor Vasquez. She had walked 6 miles from the shelter on the edge of town, her boots held together with duct tape and determination. She had not come for food. She had not come for recognition. She had come because somewhere in the crowd gathering for the memorial ceremony, her children would be standing. Her children who believed she had abandoned them 30 years ago. Her children who had no idea she was still alive. She had found a spot near the edge of the public area, half hidden behind a refreshment tent, close enough to see the stage where the ceremony would take place. Close enough to hear the names read aloud, including his name, Marcus, her husband, the man whose jacket she still wore every single day. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us. Now, let us continue. Captain Bradley Thornton had spotted her within minutes of her arrival. He was the base public affairs officer, responsible for ensuring the open house event projected the proper image of naval excellence. Homeless individuals wandering the ceremony grounds did not fit that image. But what truly offended him was the jacket. That navy jacket, clearly too large for the frail woman wearing it, with its faded patches and worn collar. In Thornton's mind, there was only one explanation. Stolen, or bought at some surplus store by someone who had never served a day in uniform. He approached with his shoulders squared and his voice pitched loud enough for the nearby families to hear. "Excuse me, Mom, where exactly did you get that jacket?" Eleanor turned slowly. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple knot, her face lined with decades of weather and grief. But her eyes, pale blue and steady, met his without flinching. She said nothing. Thornton stepped closer. "I asked you a question. That jacket belongs to the United States Navy. Unless you can prove you served, which I seriously doubt, you are in possession of stolen government property." Eleanor's voice came out soft, almost a whisper, but with a precision that seemed out of place for a woman of her appearance. "With respect, sir, I would prefer not to remove it." Thornton's lip curled. "With respect." He repeated her words mockingly. "Let me tell you what I see when I look at you. I see someone who wandered onto this base looking for a handout. I see someone who probably found that jacket in a dumpster and thought it would get you sympathy. I see someone who has no business being at an event honoring Real veterans." Around them, people were beginning to notice. Families setting up folding chairs for the ceremony. A group of older men near the memorial wall, their own service caps identifying them as veterans. A woman with a press badge adjusting her camera. Eleanor remained still. Her posture, if anyone had been paying close attention, was remarkable. Despite her worn appearance and threadbare clothing, she stood with her weight balanced, her shoulders level, her hands resting at her sides in a way that suggested decades of muscle memory. Not the posture of someone beaten down by life. The posture of someone who had learned to wait. Thornton pulled out his phone. "I'm going to document this. I'm going to make sure every base in this region knows what you look like. We do not tolerate fraud here. We do not tolerate people who steal valor they never earned." The patch on Eleanor's jacket caught the morning light as she shifted slightly. It was faded nearly to illegibility, but someone who knew what to look for might have recognized it. Someone who had served in certain communities during certain decades might have felt a cold shock of recognition. But Thornton was not that someone. He saw only what he expected to see. Eleanor's fingers brushed the patch unconsciously, a gesture she had made 10,000 times. A connection to the man who had given her this jacket on an April morning 40 years ago. Keep it warm for me, Compass. I'm coming back. Those had been his last words to her before he boarded the helicopter. Before the mission. Before everything. You have 5 minutes, Thornton announced, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. 5 minutes to remove that jacket and leave this base voluntarily. After that, I am calling military police. And I promise you, they will not be as patient as I have been. Eleanor did not respond to the threat. Her eyes had drifted past Thornton, past the crowd, to the ceremony seating being arranged near the stage. In a few minutes, her children would arrive, Margaret and Daniel. They would sit in those seats and listen to their father's name read aloud. They would accept a medal on behalf of a man they barely remembered. And they would have no idea that their mother was standing 100 feet away, wearing his jacket, carrying his memory, watching them with 40 years of longing in her heart. She was not leaving, not until she saw their faces, not until she heard his name one more time. Thornton mistook her silence for submission. Good. I see we understand each other. His smile was theatrical, designed for the witnesses. This is what happens when you try to take advantage of naval hospitality. This is what happens when you disrespect the uniform. But what Thornton did not know, what he could not possibly know, was that somewhere in the crowd of veterans near the memorial wall, a man had stopped mid-conversation. Retired Master Chief Samuel Okoro had caught a glimpse of the confrontation. He had seen the old woman's posture. He had noticed the way she stood when addressed. And something about it had made his blood run cold. Because he had seen that posture before. In photographs. In classified briefings. In a world that officially did not exist. And if he was right about what he was seeing, then everything was about to change. The weight of the jacket on her shoulders pulled Eleanor back through time. 40 years collapsed into a single breath, and she was no longer standing on a memorial plaza surrounded by strangers. She was standing in a cramped briefing room on a naval installation that did not officially exist, watching her husband study satellite photographs of a Soviet submarine. April 1983, the height of the Cold War. Eleanor and Marcus Vasquez had been married for 12 years and partners in operations for nearly as long. She was never officially listed on any roster. Women were not permitted in special operations. But Eleanor had a gift for intelligence work, for seeing patterns others missed, for coordinating extractions when everything fell apart. The men who ran the classified world had learned to look the other way when she appeared in briefing rooms. They called her Compass because she always found the way home. She always brought her people back. That April morning, the briefing had been urgent. A Soviet submarine carrying nuclear missiles had been detected off the Atlantic coast. A defector embedded within the Soviet Naval Command had critical information about the submarine's targeting protocols. He needed extraction before the Soviets discovered his betrayal. Before they launched, Marcus had been selected to lead the ground team. Eleanor would run coordination from a forward position, close enough to maintain communication, close enough to intervene if everything went wrong. It was not the first time they had worked together under impossible conditions. They had survived black tide in 1981. They had survived nightfall in 1979. They had survived a dozen operations that would never appear in any official record. But that morning, something had felt different. Marcus had paused at the door of their quarters, turning back to look at her. He had taken off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The jacket she still wore now for decades later. Keep it warm for me, Compass. I'm coming back. She had laughed and told him he was being dramatic. She had kissed him and promised to have coffee waiting when he returned. She had watched him walk toward the helicopter with that easy confidence she had fallen in love with 20 years earlier. She never saw him alive again. The extraction had gone wrong from the beginning. The defector's position had been compromised. Soviet forces were waiting. Marcus had gotten the asset out, had gotten most of his team to the extraction point, but the ambush had caught them in the final 100 meters. Eleanor had listened over the radio as gunfire erupted. She had heard Marcus shouting orders, heard him calling for suppressive fire, heard him telling his men to move while he covered their retreat. Then she had heard the RPG launch, the explosion, the silence that followed. She had broken protocol. She had left her coordination post and moved toward the extraction point, carrying only a sidearm and a desperate hope that the silence meant nothing. She had found him in a drainage culvert, his team clustered around him, trying to stop the bleeding from wounds that could not be stopped. He had looked up at her with those dark eyes she had loved since she was 19 years old. His hand had found hers, slick with his blood. "Tell the kids their mom is the bravest person I know." His voice had been barely a whisper. "The compass always points home, Ellie. Find your way back." He had died in her arms 90 seconds later. She had not found her way back. Not really. She had completed the mission because that was what Marcus would have expected. She had coordinated the final extraction, had gotten the defector to safety, had ensured the intelligence reached the right hands in time to prevent the submarine from launching. 200 American sailors had lived because she had held herself together long enough to finish what Marcus had started. But when a mission ended, so did she. The breakdown had come 3 weeks later. The Navy had classified it along with everything else. Eleanor Vasquez, who did not officially exist in any operational capacity, had been quietly institutionalized in a facility that did not officially exist either. Her children, Margaret and Daniel, 12 and 10 years old, had been told that their mother had left, that she had abandoned them in her grief, that she was not coming back. It had taken 2 years for Eleanor to emerge from the darkness. 2 years of silence and sedation and slow rebuilding of a mind that had shattered under the weight of impossible loss. When she finally surfaced, her children were gone, placed with Marcus's sister, raised to believe their mother had chosen to leave them. She had tried to reach them. Letters returned unopened. Phone calls that went to answering machines and were never returned. Eventually, Marcus's sister had sent a final message. "Stop. You have done enough damage. Let them heal." So Eleanor had stopped. She had let them heal. She had let them grow up believing the worst of her because she believed it herself. What kind of mother disappeared for 2 years? What kind of wife survived when her husband did not? What kind of person carried classified secrets that could never be spoken while her children learned to hate a ghost? She had spent the next 3 decades watching from a distance. She knew when Margaret graduated from nursing school. She knew when Daniel took a civilian position with the Navy. She knew about Daniel's wedding, about his daughter born 8 years ago, about the granddaughter she had never held. She attended veterans' events where her children might appear, always staying in the shadows, always leaving before she could be seen. The jacket was all she had left of him. The jacket and the coordinates tattooed on her forearm. The date of his death, his initials beneath the numbers. She touched them every morning when she woke in whatever shelter had a bed for her. She whispered his name every night before she slept. Still here, Marcus. Still trying. Now she stood on a naval base, a captain's threats ringing in her ears, and watched the ceremony preparations unfold before her. In a few minutes, her children would take their seats. In a few minutes, Marcus's name would be read aloud for the first time in decades, his sacrifice finally acknowledged in some small official way. She had traveled 300 miles for this moment. She had walked 6 miles this morning on feet blistered and aching. She had endured the captain's contempt and the stares of strangers. She was not leaving. Not until she heard his name. Not until she saw their faces one more time. And if that meant standing here while a man who had never seen combat threatened to have her arrested, then she would stand. She would wait. She would endure. Because that was what she had always done. That was what the compass did. It pointed toward home, even when home was nothing more than a memory and a prayer. Her fingers tightened on the sleeve of the jacket. Somewhere behind her, she could hear Thornton speaking into his radio, summoning military police. Somewhere ahead of her, ceremony staff were testing the microphone on the stage. And somewhere in between, her children were approaching, unaware that the mother they had mourned and hated for 30 years was standing close enough to touch. Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself remember his voice one more time. "Keep it warm for me, compass. I am coming back." "I kept it warm, Marcus." She breathed the words so softly no one could hear. "I'm still keeping it warm. And today, I am going to hear your name." Captain Thornton was enjoying himself. Eleanor could see it in the way he positioned his body, angling toward the growing crowd, ensuring his voice carried to the maximum number of witnesses. This was performance. This was theater. And she was the prop he had chosen for his demonstration of authority. "You know what I find most offensive?" he announced, gesturing toward Eleanor's jacket. "It is not just the stolen property. It is the audacity, the absolute gall of someone who has never served trying to pass themselves off at an event honoring real heroes." A woman nearby pulled her children closer, shielding them from the confrontation as if homelessness were contagious. A man in a business suit shook his head with visible disgust. Whether the disgust was aimed at Eleanor or at Thornton, she could not tell. Eleanor remained silent. She had learned long ago that words rarely changed minds already made up. She had learned that dignity was sometimes the only weapon available to those without power. So she stood with her shoulders level and her hands still, letting Thornton's contempt wash over her like weather. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp. "Do you even know what that patch means?" He jabbed a finger toward the faded insignia on her chest. "Do you have any idea what unit that represents? Or did you just think it looked impressive?" Eleanor's eyes flickered to the patch. She knew exactly what it meant. She knew because she had been there when they designed it. She knew because she had helped choose the colors, the symbols, the Latin phrase that circled the eagle. She knew because 12 of those patches had been made, and only 3 of the people who had worn them were still alive. But she said nothing. Thornton mistook her silence for ignorance. "That is what I thought. You probably cannot even read the Latin." He laughed, a sharp bark designed to invite others to join in the mockery. "Let me help you out. It means something about honor and sacrifice, concepts you would not understand." Near the memorial wall, Master Chief Samuel Okoro had stopped pretending to listen to his companions. His attention was fixed entirely on the confrontation unfolding across the plaza. Something about the old woman's bearing had triggered a memory he could not quite place. The way she stood when challenged. The way her weight balanced on the balls of her feet. The way her hands rested at her sides, fingers slightly curved, ready. He had seen that posture before. In training films from the classified archives. In photographs of operators who had worked in the shadows during the coldest years of the Cold War. Men and women who did not officially exist, running operations that would never be acknowledged. Okoro excused himself from his group and began moving closer. His curiosity had become something more urgent. A suspicion he was almost afraid to examine. Thornton was still performing. He had pulled out his phone again, holding it up to photograph Eleanor. "This is going on the alert network. Every base commander on the East Coast is going to know your face by tonight. You picked the wrong place to try your scam." Eleanor's gaze shifted past him, past the crowd, to the ceremony seating area. 2 figures had just arrived and were making their way toward the front rows. A woman in her late 40s with graying hair and a careful walk. A man slightly younger, his bearing suggesting military familiarity even in civilian clothes. Margaret and Daniel. Her children, close enough now that she could see the lines around their eyes, the gray threading through their hair. They had aged. Of course they had aged. 30 years had passed. But to Eleanor, they were still the children she had tucked into bed the night before Marcus left for his final mission. Her breath caught in her throat. Her composure, held together by decades of practice, trembled for just a moment. Thornton noticed the shift in her attention and turned to follow her gaze. "Friends of yours?" He laughed. "I doubt it. People like you do not have friends at events like this. People like you have victims. People you have fooled into thinking you are something you are not." He stepped into her line of sight, deliberately blocking her view of her children. "I'm talking to you. Look at me when I'm addressing you." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the confrontation began. She saw a man perhaps 45 years old, well-fed and confident, whose uniform bore no combat ribbons, whose hands had never held a weapon in anger, whose understanding of service was limited to press releases and photo opportunities. She felt something flicker in her chest. Not anger exactly, something older and colder. Something she had not permitted herself to feel in a very long time. "Sir," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I am not going to remove this jacket." Thornton's eyes widened slightly. The direct refusal seemed to surprise him. He had expected submission. He had expected fear. Instead, he was looking at something he did not recognize, something that should not exist in someone of her apparent circumstances. "Excuse me." His voice dropped, becoming more threatening. "Did you just refuse a direct order?" "I'm not under your command, Captain." Eleanor's words were precise, each one carefully placed. "And this jacket is not stolen. It was given to me. Given to you." Thornton laughed again, but there was an edge to it now. Uncertainty creeping in at the margins. By who? Some drunk at a bar. Some other homeless person who needed money for their next fix. Behind him, Okoro had moved close enough to hear the exchange. His eyes were fixed on Eleanor's hands, on the faded scars across her knuckles, on the way her fingers had curled slightly at Thornton's last insult. Not into fists, into something else. A configuration he had seen before. A ready position that operators learned and never forgot. His heart was pounding now, because if he was right about what he was seeing, then the captain had made a mistake that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Thornton grabbed his radio. "This is Captain Thornton at the Memorial Plaza. I need 2 MPs here immediately. I have a trespasser refusing to comply with lawful orders." The radio crackled an acknowledgement. Help was coming. In Thornton's mind, the situation was nearly resolved. The MPs would arrive, the woman would be escorted off base, and the ceremony would proceed without further embarrassment. He had no idea that the woman standing before him had once held a radio, just like his, coordinating an extraction under enemy fire, talking her husband's team through an ambush while Soviet bullets cracked overhead. He had no idea that her calm demeanor was not submission, but training. Not weakness, but control. And he had no idea that in the crowd of veterans near the memorial wall, a man was staring at the patch on her jacket with growing recognition. A man who had once been briefed on an operation called Compass Point. A man who had been told that a woman codenamed Compass had saved 200 American lives, including his own. Okoro's hands had begun to shake, because the patch on that jacket was not generic surplus. It was unit-specific, one of only 12 ever made. And if the woman wearing it was who he thought she was, then the word impossible had just lost all meaning. Eleanor watched her children take their seats in the front row of the ceremony area. Margaret smoothed her dress and leaned over to whisper something to Daniel. He nodded and checked his watch. They looked comfortable with each other, the easy familiarity of siblings who had grown close through shared loss. She had missed all of it. Every birthday, every graduation, every holiday meal. She had missed Margaret's nursing school pinning ceremony. She had missed Daniel's wedding. She had missed the birth of her granddaughter, a girl she had only ever seen in photographs clipped from community newsletters. The weight of those absences pressed down on her chest like a physical thing. 30 years of silence. 30 years of watching from shadows. 30 years of convincing herself that her children were better off believing she had abandoned them than knowing the truth of what she had been, what she had done, what she had lost. She remembered the last time she had held them. The night before Marcus left for Operation Compass Point. They had been so small then. Margaret with her serious eyes and her endless questions. Daniel with his father's laugh and his mother's stubbornness. She had tucked them in a bed and promised to be there when they woke up. She had not been there. Not that morning. Not any morning for 30 years. The breakdown had come without warning. 3 weeks after Marcus died, 3 weeks after she had carried his body to the extraction helicopter while his blood soaked through her clothes, she had simply stopped functioning. The Navy doctors had called it acute stress reaction complicated by prolonged operational trauma. Eleanor had called it drowning. One moment, she had been standing in her kitchen making coffee. The next moment, she had been on the floor, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but relive the sound of the RPG and the silence that followed. The facility they had taken her to was quiet and clean and utterly removed from the world. No windows in her room. No newspapers. No contact with anyone from her previous life. The doctors had explained that complete isolation was necessary for her recovery. The Navy had explained that her condition, like her service, needed to remain classified. She had not known that her children were being told she had left voluntarily. She had not known that Marcus's sister was raising them to believe their mother had chosen to abandon them in their grief. By the time she emerged from the facility, thin and medicated and barely functional, the lie had become truth. Her children hated a woman who no longer existed. And Eleanor, carrying guilt for surviving when Marcus had not, had decided they were right to hate her. She had written letters, dozens of them over the years. She had tried to explain without revealing classified information. She had tried to apologize without making excuses. Every letter had come back unopened. Eventually, she had stopped writing. But she had never stopped watching. She knew that Margaret volunteered at a veterans shelter downtown, never knowing that her own mother might be sleeping in one of the beds she made. She knew that Daniel had named his daughter Elena, a name close enough to Eleanor that it made her weep every time she thought of it. She knew that both of them came to Veterans Memorial events whenever their father's service was recognized, honoring a man they remembered and mourning a mother they believed had failed them. Today was supposed to be like all the other times. Watch from a distance. See their faces. Hear Marcus's name. Leave before anyone noticed her. But Thornton had noticed. Thornton had made a scene. And now Eleanor was trapped between the captain's threats and her desperate need to stay, to witness, to be present even if invisible. Margaret laughed at something Daniel said. The sound carried across the plaza, clear and bright, and Eleanor felt her heart crack along fault lines she had thought were long since healed. Her daughter's laugh. She had not heard it in 30 years. It sounded exactly like Marcus. She closed her eyes and let herself remember the last time their whole family had been together. A Sunday dinner 2 weeks before the final mission. Marcus grilling steaks in the backyard while the children played. Eleanor watching from the kitchen window, feeling a contentment so complete it had frightened her. Happiness like that did not last. She had known it even then. She had been right. Captain Thornton's voice cut through her reverie. He was speaking into his radio again, confirming the MP request, adding details about the suspect's description. Elderly female, he said, approximately 70 years of age, wearing what appears to be stolen Navy property, possibly mentally disturbed. Mentally disturbed. Eleanor almost smiled. She supposed she was, in a way, what sane person would spend 30 years living on the margins, watching her family from shadows, carrying a dead man's jacket like a talisman against loneliness. What sane person would walk 6 miles on blistered feet just to hear a name spoken aloud? But sanity was a luxury Eleanor had surrendered long ago. All she had left was endurance. The ability to keep going when stopping made more sense. The ability to stand still while a man half her age threatened her with arrest. The ability to wait. Marcus had called it her superpower. You can outwait anyone, Ellie. You can outwait the weather. You can outwait God himself if you had to. She was waiting now, waiting for the ceremony to begin, waiting to hear his name, waiting to see her children one more time before the MPs arrived and escorted her away. Near the memorial wall, Okoro had moved close enough to see the patch on Eleanor's jacket clearly. His breath caught in his throat. The design was unmistakable now. The eagle. The compass rose. The Latin phrase he had memorized 40 years ago during a classified briefing about an operation that had saved his submarine from Soviet detection. He knew that patch. He knew what it represented. And he knew, with a certainty that made his hands tremble, that the woman wearing it had not found it in a surplus store. His eyes dropped to her hands, to the scars across her knuckles, to the faded ink barely visible beneath the grime on her wrist. He could not make out the details from this distance, but he could see enough to know that something was there, something that did not belong on a random homeless woman, something that might change everything. Okoro began moving toward the confrontation, his heart pounding with each step. Because if he was right, if the impossible was actually true, then he was about to witness something that would shake this base to its foundations. And the captain who was currently threatening that woman had no idea what storm he was about to unleash. 2 military police officers appeared at the edge of the plaza, their boots crunching on the gravel path as they approached. Both were young, barely 30, their faces professionally blank as they assessed the situation. Thornton waved them over with the satisfied air of a man whose authority was about to be reinforced. "Officers," he said, gesturing toward Eleanor. "This individual has refused to leave base property and is wearing what I believe to be stolen Navy equipment. I need her escorted off the premises immediately." The first MP, a petty officer with a name tag reading Hendricks, looked Eleanor up and down. His expression revealed nothing. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us." Eleanor did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on the ceremony seating, where her children sat unaware of the confrontation unfolding 100 feet away. She could see Margaret checking her phone, Daniel adjusting his tie. Small, ordinary moments that meant everything to a woman who had missed 30 years of such moments. "Mom." Hendricks stepped closer. "I need you to comply." "She is clearly disturbed," Thornton interjected. "Probably off her medication. You may need to use physical restraint." Before the MPs could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. A woman's voice, calm, but carrying an undertone of authority that made everyone pause. "Captain Thornton, I would like to speak with this woman before any action is taken." Lieutenant Commander Patricia Chun had been watching the confrontation from near the refreshment area. She had come to the open house event to recruit for her veteran reintegration program, but the scene unfolding before her had captured her full attention. Something about the old woman's bearing did not match her circumstances. Something about her stillness suggested depth rather than defeat. Chun approached with measured steps, her uniform crisp, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp. She positioned herself between Eleanor and the MPs, creating a buffer without directly challenging Thornton's authority. "Commander," Thornton said, his voice tightening with irritation. "This is a security matter. I have it under control." "I can see that, Captain." Chun kept her tone respectful, but did not yield ground. "I simply think that perhaps a conversation might resolve this more efficiently than an arrest. Fewer reports to file. Less disruption to the ceremony." Thornton's jaw tightened. The logic was sound, but he clearly resented the interference. "Fine. You have 2 minutes." Chun turned to Eleanor, and something in her face softened almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am, my name is Patricia Chun. I run a reintegration program for veterans on this base. Is there somewhere you need to be today? Someone I can call for you?" Eleanor looked at her, really looked the way she had looked at Thornton earlier. But this time what she saw was different. She saw a woman, perhaps 50 years old, with the careful eyes of someone who had learned to recognize pain in others. She saw a uniform worn with pride, but not arrogance. She saw a potential ally in a situation where allies seemed impossible. "I just wanted to see them," Eleanor said softly. Her voice cracked slightly on the words, the first sign of emotion she had shown since the confrontation began. "One more time. That is all." Chen's brow furrowed. "See who, ma'am?" Eleanor's gaze drifted back toward the ceremony seating, toward Margaret and Daniel, toward the children who did not know she existed. Chun followed her gaze, noted the direction, filed it away. She recognized the look in Eleanor's eyes. She had seen it before, in the faces of veterans who had lost everything and everyone, who clung to scraps of connection because scraps were all they had left. "Ma'am," she said gently, "whatever has happened, there are people who can help. My program does not require paperwork or bureaucracy, just a conversation. Would you be willing to talk to me after the ceremony?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "I will not be here after the ceremony." She glanced at the MPs, at Thornton's satisfied smirk. "That seems clear." Chun opened her mouth to respond, but Thornton cut her off. "Time is up, Commander." He nodded to the MPs. "Remove her from the base." Hendricks stepped forward, reaching for Eleanor's arm. And that was when Master Chief Samuel Okoro finally spoke. "Stop." The word was not loud, but it carried the weight of 40 years of service. Hendricks froze mid-motion. Even Thornton turned, surprised by the interruption from a direction he had not been monitoring. Okoro stood 10 feet away, his weathered face pale beneath his tan. His eyes were fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that made everyone uncomfortable. More specifically, his eyes were fixed on the patch on her jacket. "Captain Thornton," Okoro said, his voice carefully controlled. "I need you to stand down." Thornton's face flushed with anger. Master Chief, I do not know who you think you are, but you have no authority here. This is my base, my event, and my decision. Okoro did not look at him. His attention remained locked on Eleanor, on the jacket, on the faded ink barely visible at the edge of her sleeve. Ma'am, he said softly, where did you get those coordinates? The question hung in the air like a held breath. Eleanor's composure flickered. Her hand moved unconsciously toward her wrist, toward the tattoo hidden beneath layers of grime and time. Thornton laughed, but there was uncertainty in it now. Coordinates? What coordinates? This is ridiculous. But Okoro was not listening to Thornton anymore. He was watching Eleanor's face. He was watching the way her expression shifted, the mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something underneath. Something that looked like recognition, something that looked like fear, and something that looked like the faintest glimmer of hope. Those coordinates, Okoro continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I know what they mean. I know where they lead. And if you are who I think you are, then every person on this base owes you their lives. Starting with me. The plaza had gone quiet. The MPs stood frozen. Chun watched with growing confusion. Thornton's mouth opened and closed, searching for words that would not come. And Eleanor Vasquez, who had spent 40 years hiding in plain sight, felt the wall she had built beginning to crack. The silence stretched across the plaza like a held breath. Okoro's question hung in the air, unanswered, while Eleanor stood frozen between the past she had buried and the present that threatened to unearth it. Thornton recovered first. Master Chief, I do not know what game you think you are playing, but this woman is a trespasser. She is wearing stolen property. Whatever coordinates you think you see are probably something she copied from the internet to make her story more convincing. Okoro finally turned to look at Thornton. His expression was cold in a way that made the younger man take an involuntary step backward. Captain, he said quietly, have you ever served in a combat zone? Thornton's face reddened. I do not see how that is relevant. It is relevant because if you had, you would recognize the way this woman stands. You would recognize the scars on her hands. You would recognize that the patch on her jacket is not something you can buy at a surplus store because only 12 of them were ever made. He paused, letting the words sink in. And you would know better than to demand that a veteran remove symbols of service you do not understand. The MPs exchanged uncertain glances. Chun watched with growing interest, her instincts telling her that something significant was unfolding. The crowd that had gathered around the confrontation pressed closer, sensing drama. Eleanor spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. How do you know about the patches? Okoro turned back to her. His eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. Because I was there, ma'am. April 1983. I was a young petty officer on the USS Hartford. We were running silent in the North Atlantic when a Soviet submarine got a fix on our position. We should have been dead. He swallowed hard. But someone ran an operation that drew them away. Someone extracted a defector who had information about Soviet tracking protocols. Someone gave us the window we needed to disappear. He took a step closer to Eleanor. I was briefed on that operation 20 years later when I made Master Chief. They showed us photographs of the unit that ran it. They told us about the woman who coordinated the extraction after the team leader was killed. They told us her call sign. Eleanor closed her eyes. The name she had not spoken aloud in decades pressed against her lips like a prayer. Compass, Okoro said softly. They called her Compass because she always found the way home. The word rippled through the crowd. Thornton's face had gone pale, his confidence evaporating as he began to understand the magnitude of his error. Chen's hand had risen to cover her mouth. The MPs stood motionless, uncertain how to proceed. Eleanor opened her eyes. The mask was gone now. In its place was something raw and real, a grief so old it had become part of her bones. My husband gave me that call sign, she said. The first time we worked together, he said I had a gift for navigation, for finding paths others could not see. She touched the patch on her jacket with trembling fingers. This was his jacket. He gave it to me the morning he left for the extraction. He told me to keep it warm for him. Her voice broke. He never came back. The plaza had gone completely still. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath as the truth emerged. Okoro's knees buckled slightly. He caught himself, straightening with visible effort. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The operation that saved my boat. The extraction that prevented a Soviet nuclear launch. That was you." It was not a question. It was a recognition. Eleanor nodded slowly. "That was us. Marcus and me. And when Marcus went down, when the ambush caught them in the last 100 meters, I finished what he started." She looked at Thornton, who had retreated several steps and was staring at her, as if she had transformed into something unrecognizable. "I carried his body to the extraction point. I coordinated the final withdrawal. I got the defector to safety because that was what Marcus would have expected, because stopping was not an option." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that silenced any remaining doubt. 200 sailors on the USS Hartford lived because we completed that mission. The Soviet submarine never launched because we got the targeting protocols to Fleet Command in time. And my husband died in a drainage ditch 12,000 miles from home because he would not leave his men behind. Thornton opened his mouth, but no words came out. His face had shifted from red to gray, the color draining as the full scope of his mistake became clear. Chun stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for what you have endured. For everything." She shot a pointed look at Thornton. "And I am sorry for how you have been treated here today." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "I did not come here for apologies. I did not come here to be recognized." She turned her gaze toward the ceremony seating, toward her children, who remained unaware of the unfolding revelation. "I came here to hear his name, to see their faces. One more time." Okoro followed her gaze, understanding dawning. "Those people in the front row," he said softly. "At the ceremony. My children," Eleanor whispered. "They think I abandoned them. They have hated me for 30 years. And they have no idea I have been watching them grow up from a distance, too ashamed to come home." The confession hung in the air, more devastating than any classified operation, more painful than any combat wound. The woman who had saved 200 lives had spent 3 decades unable to save herself. And now, standing in her dead husband's jacket, surrounded by strangers who were only beginning to understand what they were witnessing, Eleanor Vasquez felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 40 years. Hope. Fragile and terrifying, but hope nonetheless. Eleanor could have walked away. The confrontation had shifted in her favor. Thornton had retreated into stunned silence. The MPs stood at a respectful distance, their earlier aggression replaced by uncertainty. Okoro watched her with something approaching reverence. Chun had positioned herself as a protective barrier between Eleanor and any further harassment. She could have slipped away while everyone processed what they had learned. She could have disappeared back into the margins where she had lived for 30 years. She could have preserved the distance that had become her only defense against a pain too vast to confront. But Margaret laughed again, that bright, clear sound that carried across the plaza like a bell. And Eleanor found that she could not move, could not leave, could not tear herself away from the only connection to her children she had allowed herself in 3 decades. Okoro watched the emotions play across her face. "Ma'am," he said gently, "your children, do they know you are here?" Eleanor shook her head. "They do not know I am alive. Not really. They were told I left them, that I abandoned them after their father died." She swallowed hard. They were not wrong to believe it. I did leave them. I just did not have a choice in the matter. Chun stepped closer, her voice soft. "What happened?" "The breakdown happened." Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides, the only outward sign of the storm within. 3 weeks after Marcus died, I stopped functioning. The Navy classified my condition along with everything else about my service. They put me in a facility for 2 years. By the time I emerged, my children had been told I left voluntarily. They had been raised to believe I chose to abandon them. "And you never corrected that," Okoro said. "It was not an accusation. It was an attempt to understand." Eleanor looked at him with eyes that held 40 years of accumulated grief. "How could I correct it? Everything about my service was classified. Everything about my breakdown was classified. I could not explain without revealing information that would have put other operations at risk. She paused, and part of me believed they were better off hating a ghost than loving a broken woman. The ceremony area had begun to fill with attendees. More chairs were being occupied. More families were settling in for the recognition of the fallen. The microphone on the stage crackled as technicians tested the sound system. Eleanor watched her children from across the plaza. Margaret was reading the program now, her finger tracing down the list of names. Daniel sat with his arm around the empty chair beside him, the chair where his wife would have sat if she had not stayed home with their daughter. I used to imagine what I would say to them, Eleanor murmured. I wrote scripts in my head, explanations, apologies, justifications, but none of them mattered, because the truth is, I failed them. Whatever the circumstances, whatever the reasons, I was not there when they needed me. And no explanation can undo 30 years of absence. Shin reached out and touched Eleanor's arm gently. Sometimes the explanation is not meant to undo the past. It is meant to open the door to a different future. Eleanor looked at her. A different future. She almost smiled, but there was no joy in it. I am 71 years old. I have spent more of my life hiding than living. I do not know if there is enough future left for things to be different. Okoro shook his head. Ma'am, with respect, you are wrong. He gestured toward the ceremony area. Those people over there, your children, they came here to honor their father, to honor a man who gave his life for his country. Do you think they would not want to know the truth about their mother? Do you think they would not want to understand why? Eleanor was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I am afraid. The admission hung in the air, raw and honest. This woman who had run operations in hostile territory, who had carried her husband's body through enemy fire, who had prevented nuclear escalation through sheer force of will, was afraid. Afraid of what? Chen asked softly. Afraid that they will look at me and see what everyone else sees. A homeless woman in a stolen jacket. Afraid that the truth will not matter. That 30 years is too long. That some absences cannot be explained away. Eleanor's voice cracked. Afraid that I will finally have the chance to speak, and they will walk away. From the ceremony stage, a voice announced that the program would begin in 10 minutes. Families were asked to take their seats. The names of the fallen would be read. Medals would be presented. Eleanor's window was closing. In 10 minutes, her children would be absorbed in the ceremony. In 10 minutes, the moment would pass. Okoro stepped directly in front of her, forcing her to meet his eyes. Ma'am, I spent 40 years not knowing who saved my life. 40 years wondering about the operation that gave me a future. A wife. Children. Grandchildren. He placed his weathered hand over his heart. You gave me all of that. You and your husband. And I never got to say thank you. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. Your children deserve to know who their mother really is. Not the ghost they have been hating. The hero they never knew. And you deserve to stop hiding. After everything you have done, you deserve to come home. Eleanor looked past him, toward the ceremony seating, toward Margaret and Daniel, toward the family she had watched from shadows for 30 years. And something in her face shifted. The fear remained. But beneath it, stronger than it had been in decades, was something else. Determination. She straightened her shoulders. The movement was subtle, but it transformed her. The homeless woman disappeared, and in her place stood someone else. Someone who had once been called Compass. Someone who had always found the way home. All right, she said softly. All right. Thornton had been watching the exchange from a distance, his face cycling through shades of gray and green as the full weight of his error settled upon him. Now, as Eleanor straightened her shoulders and something changed in her bearing, he made one final desperate attempt to salvage his authority. This is still a security matter, he announced, his voice cracking slightly. Whatever she claims to have done, there is no verification. No documentación. Anyone can tell a story. Okoro turned to face him, and the look in his eyes made Thornton take another step backward. Captain, I'm going to give you some advice. Stop talking. Right now, before you make this worse than it already is. You cannot speak to me that way. Thornton's protest was weak, the words of a man who knew he had already lost but could not bring himself to admit it. I am a commissioned officer. and I am a retired Master Chief with 40 years of service and a Medal of Valor that I earned in a combat zone you could not find on a map. Okoro's voice was cold and steady. I know what I saw in those classified briefings. I know what that patch means. And I know that the woman you have been publicly humiliating for the past 20 minutes is worth more than every public affairs officer this Navy has ever produced. Thornton's mouth opened and closed. No sound came out. Chun stepped forward, positioning herself beside Eleanor. Captain Thornton, I suggest you remove yourself from the situation. Immediately. She paused. Before it becomes a matter for the Inspector General. The threat landed like a physical blow. Thornton looked around at the crowd that had gathered, at the phones that had been recording, at the witnesses who had seen everything. His career flashed before his eyes, and in that flash, he saw its end. Without another word, he turned and walked away. His steps were unsteady, his shoulders hunched. The captain who had arrived, so confident in his authority, departed as a man who had just watched his future crumble. Eleanor barely noticed his departure. Her attention was fixed on the ceremony stage, where the program coordinator was approaching the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, the coordinator announced, "We will begin our recognition ceremony in 5 minutes. Please take your seats." 5 minutes. Eleanor had 5 minutes to decide how to approach the children she had not spoken to in 30 years. 5 minutes to find words that could bridge an absence that had defined their lives. Okoro touched her arm gently. "Ma'am, how do you want to do this?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "I do not know. I have imagined this moment so many times. But in my imagination, I always had the right words. Now that it is real, I cannot think of anything that does not sound like an excuse." "Then do not make excuses," Chun said softly. "Just tell them the truth. Tell them you are their mother. Tell them you never stopped loving them. The rest can come later." Eleanor looked at her, this woman she had just met who spoke with the confidence of someone who understood loss. "How do you know that will be enough?" Chun smiled sadly. "I do not know if it will be enough. But I know that silence is not enough either. You have tried silence for 30 years. Maybe it is time to try something else." The ceremony coordinator was directing families to their seats. Eleanor could see Margaret and Daniel settling in, their attention turning toward the stage. In a few moments, the program would begin. Marcus's name would be read. A medal would be presented. And Eleanor would either step forward or fade back into the shadows where she had lived for so long. She took a deep breath. The air tasted different somehow. Cleaner. Sharper. Like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. "I'm going to wait until after they call his name," she said quietly. "I want them to hear it first. I want them to honor him before I complicate everything." Okoro nodded. "That seems right. And then I'm going to walk over there." Eleanor's voice was steady now. The fear still present, but no longer in control. "I'm going to stand in front of them in this jacket that their father gave me. And I'm going to tell them who I am. Whatever happens after that, happens." Chun reached out and squeezed her hand. "Would you like us to come with you?" Eleanor considered the offer. Then she shook her head. "No, this is something I need to do alone." She paused. "But thank you. For seeing me. For not looking away." The ceremony music began to play. A color guard marched toward the stage, flags held high. The audience rose to their feet in respect. Eleanor watched her children stand. Margaret's hand pressed over her heart. Daniel's posture straightened, his Navy background showing in the precision of his stance. She had missed so much. First steps and graduations and weddings and births. She had missed the moments that made a life, choosing instead to watch from shadows like a ghost haunting her own family. But Ghost did not feel this racing heartbeat. Ghost did not feel this burning in their chest. Ghost did not feel this desperate, terrifying, overwhelming hope. She was not a ghost. She was a mother, broken and absent and flawed, but still a mother. And in a few minutes, for the first time in 30 years, her children would know she was alive. The ceremony coordinator returned to the microphone. "Welcome to our annual recognition of heroes," he began. "Today, we honor those who gave everything in service to their country." Eleanor closed her eyes and let Marcus's face fill her mind one more time. "I'm still here, Marcus." She shaped the words silently. "Still trying." And today, finally, I'm going to stop hiding. She opened her eyes. The ceremony had begun. The ceremony coordinator's voice carried across the plaza with practiced solemnity. Today we honor the men and women whose sacrifice made possible the freedoms we enjoy. Their names are written not only on these walls, but in the hearts of everyone who knew them. Eleanor stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes fixed on her children in the front row. Margaret had pulled a tissue from her purse, anticipating the emotion that always accompanied these ceremonies. Daniel sat rigidly upright, his jaw tight with the controlled grief of a man who had learned to mourn in public without breaking. They had done this before. Eleanor knew because she had watched them do it. Every year, at every ceremony where their father's service was recognized, they showed up. They listened. They honored. And then they went home to lives that had been built on the foundation of loss. The coordinator began reading names. Each one was followed by a brief description of service, a moment of silence, a smattering of applause from families who had come to witness their loved ones remembered. Eleanor waited. Her heart pounded against her ribs with each name that was not his. Her fingers clutched the fabric of his jacket, drawing strength from the worn material that still carried the faintest trace of who he had been. Okoro had moved to stand beside her, a silent sentinel. Chen remained nearby, her presence a comfort Eleanor had not expected to find on this day of all days. And then the coordinator's voice shifted, taking on a weight that signaled something significant. We come now to a special recognition. A hero whose sacrifice remained classified for decades, whose actions saved hundreds of American lives, and whose story has only recently been cleared for public acknowledgement. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had not known this. She had not known that Marcus's service was being declassified, that his story was finally being told. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Vasquez, the coordinator, continued. Operation Compass Point, April 1983. In the front row, Margaret and Daniel leaned forward. They knew some of the story. They knew their father had died in a classified operation, but they had never been told the details. The Navy had never permitted it. Chief Vasquez led a 6-man extraction team into hostile territory to recover a Soviet defector whose intelligence was critical to preventing nuclear escalation. The coordinator's voice was clear and steady. When the team was ambushed in the final phase of extraction, Chief Vasquez provided covering fire that allowed his teammates and the asset to reach safety. He gave his life so that others might live. Margaret's hand found Daniel's. They gripped each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces as they finally heard the truth about how their father had died. But the coordinator was not finished. What has only recently been declassified is the role of Chief Vasquez's partner in the operation. A woman whose contribution was never officially acknowledged due to restrictions on female participation in special operations at that time. Eleanor felt the world tilt beneath her feet. This was not supposed to happen. This was not part of what she had come here to witness. This woman, known by the call sign Compass, coordinated the extraction after Chief Vasquez fell. She recovered his body under enemy fire. She completed the mission that he had begun, and she ensured that the intelligence reached Fleet Command in time to prevent a Soviet nuclear submarine from launching its missiles. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. The coordinator looked up from his notes. 200 American sailors on the USS Hartford owe their lives to the actions of Chief Vasquez and his partner. The entire eastern seaboard may owe its existence to the intelligence they recovered that day. Okoro's hand found Eleanor's shoulder. His grip was firm, steadying her as she swayed on her feet. In the front row, Margaret and Daniel sat frozen. They had known their father was a hero. They had not known there was more to the story. They had not known about a woman called Compass. For decades, the coordinator continued. This woman's identity remained classified, her service unacknowledged, her sacrifice unknown. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that silenced any remaining whispers. Today, we can finally speak her name. Eleanor Vasquez, wife of Chief Marcus Vasquez, mother of 2, call sign Compass. The name echoed across the plaza like a thunderclap. Margaret's head snapped up. Her face went white. Her lips formed a word that made no sound. Daniel turned, his eyes scanning the crowd with desperate intensity. Searching, hoping, terrified. And Eleanor, standing at the edge of the ceremony in her dead husband's jacket, felt 30 years of hiding come crashing down around her. Her children knew her name. They knew her story. And in a moment, they would know she was standing 50 feet away, watching them with a lifetime of love and regret written across her face. The coordinator spoke again. We had hoped to present this recognition posthumously. We believed Eleanor Vasquez had passed away, but new information has recently come to light. Eleanor's legs trembled. She had not expected this. She had not planned for this. She had come to watch from shadows, to hear his name, to see their faces. She had not come to be revealed. But the shadows were gone now. The secrets were spoken, and her children were rising from their seats, turning toward the crowd, searching for a mother they had believed was dead, searching for a ghost who had suddenly become real. Margaret saw her first, her eyes, scanning the crowd with frantic desperation, locked onto the woman standing at the edge of the plaza. The worn jacket, the gray hair, the posture that was somehow familiar despite 30 years of absence. Mom. The word tore from her throat, raw and broken. Mom. Daniel turned to follow his sister's gaze. His face cycled through disbelief, shock, recognition, and something that looked like pain and hope tangled together in a knot that could never be untied. Eleanor stood frozen. All the words she had prepared, all the explanations she had rehearsed in the lonely hours of 1,000 sleepless nights, vanished from her mind. She could only stand there, trembling in Marcus's jacket, watching her children see her for the first time in 3 decades. Margaret moved first. She pushed past the chairs, past the other attendees, past everything that stood between her and a mother she had mourned and hated and never stopped loving. Her heels caught on the grass, and she kicked them off without breaking stride. Her carefully styled hair came loose as she ran. Tears streamed down her face, ruining makeup she had applied that morning with steady hands that now shook uncontrollably. Daniel was a step behind her, his longer stride eating up the distance. His face was a mask of emotions too complex to name. 47 years old and suddenly 12 again, watching his mother disappear and not understanding why. Eleanor opened her arms. It was instinct. It was muscle memory. It was the gesture she had made 1,000 times when they were small, when they ran to her with scraped knees and broken toys and the small tragedies of childhood. Margaret hit her like a wave. The impact staggered Eleanor backward, but she held on. She held on with every ounce of strength she had left in her 71-year-old body. She held on like she should have held on 30 years ago, when the darkness came and she let it take her away from everything that mattered. Daniel's arms wrapped around them both, pulling them together, holding them up. His voice broke on a single word. Mom. Eleanor could not speak. The tears she had held back for decades finally broke free, pouring down her weathered cheeks, soaking into her daughter's hair. She could feel their heartbeats against her chest, fast and desperate, matching her own. The crowd around them had gone silent. Even the ceremony coordinator had stopped speaking, watching the reunion unfold with tears in his own eyes. Okoro stood nearby, his hand pressed over his heart, his face reflecting the magnitude of what he was witnessing. Chen had turned away, overcome by emotion. I am sorry. Eleanor finally managed to force the words out between sobs. I am so sorry. I never wanted to leave you. I never stopped loving you. I never stopped watching. Margaret pulled back just enough to look at her mother's face. Her eyes searched Eleanor's features, cataloging the changes that time and hardship had wrought. You were alive. All this time, you were alive. I wanted to come back. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. I tried. I wrote letters. I called, but you never answered. And I thought you were better off without me. I thought you were better off hating a ghost than loving a broken woman. Daniel shook his head, his jaw tight with a grief that was transforming into something else. Something that looked like the beginning of understanding. We never got the letters. Aunt Maria must have intercepted them. She told us you left. She told us you chose to abandon us. I never chose to leave you. Eleanor gripped their arms with desperate strength. Never. The breakdown happened without warning. The Navy put me away for 2 years. By the time I emerged, you were gone. You believed the worst of me, and I believed I deserved it. Margaret's face crumpled. 30 years, Mom. 30 years I hated you. 30 years I wondered what we did wrong, what made you leave us. You did nothing wrong. Eleanor cupped her daughter's face in her scarred, weathered hands. Nothing. You were perfect. You were everything. Losing you was worse than losing him. At least with your father, I got to say goodbye. The ceremony had completely stopped now. No one moved. No one spoke. The entire plaza was held in the grip of a moment that transcended recognition ceremonies and classified operations and military protocol. Daniel spoke, his voice thick. We'll look for you. After we grew up, after we realized Aunt Maria might have lied. We searched. We hired investigators. We checked shelters and hospitals and morgues. He swallowed hard. We thought you were dead. I was dead. Eleanor's voice was quiet. In all the ways that mattered. I was a ghost walking through a world I did not belong in anymore. I watched you from shadows because shadows were all I had left. She released them just enough to touch the jacket she wore. Marcus's jacket, worn thin by 40 years of use. Your father gave me this the morning he left. He told me to keep it warm for him. She looked at both of them, her children, grown now, but still carrying the wounds of a childhood marked by loss. I kept it warm. I kept his memory alive. But I cannot keep myself alive. Not the way I should have. Margaret shook her head fiercely. You are here now. That is what matters. You are here now. The coordinator's voice came through the speakers, gentle and hesitant. If the Vasquez family would like to continue this reunion in private, we can pause the ceremony. But Eleanor shook her head. No. She straightened, one arm still around each of her children, drawing strength from their presence. Finish reading the names. Honor the fallen. Her voice grew stronger. That is what we came here to do. That is what Marcus would have wanted. She looked at her children, and for the first time in 30 years, she smiled. We have time. We have all the time in the world now. Daniel's arm tightened around her. Yes, we do. The ceremony resumed, but everything had changed. Eleanor stood in the front row now, flanked by her children, her hands clasped in theirs. The seats that had been reserved for family of the honored dead had expanded to include a woman who had been dead to them for 30 years. The coordinator continued reading names, but the audience's attention kept drifting toward the Vasquez family, toward the reunion that had unfolded before their eyes, toward the woman in the worn jacket who had emerged from the margins to reclaim her place among the living. When the final name was read and the final moment of silence observed, the coordinator spoke again. Before we conclude, we have a special presentation. He gestured toward the stage. Master Chief Samuel Okoro has requested permission to speak. Okoro mounted the stage with the careful dignity of a man who understood the weight of the moment. He stood at the microphone for a long moment, gathering himself before he began. In April of 1983, I was a young petty officer serving aboard the USS Hartford. His voice was steady but thick with emotion. We were running silent in the North Atlantic when a Soviet submarine acquired our position. We should have died that day. 200 of us should have gone down with the boat. The audience was completely still. Even the children present seemed to sense the gravity of what was being shared. But we did not die. Okoro's eyes found Eleanor in the crowd. Because a man named Marcus Vasquez and a woman named Eleanor Vasquez ran an operation that drew the Soviets away. They extracted a defector whose intelligence gave us the window we needed to disappear. Marcus gave his life. Eleanor carried his body out and completed the mission anyway. He paused, letting the words settle. For 40 years, I have lived a life that should not have been possible. I married my high school sweetheart. We raised 3 children. We welcomed 7 grandchildren. Every birthday, every graduation, every wedding, every ordinary Tuesday, I have lived because of what the Vasquez family sacrificed. Tears were flowing freely in the audience now. Margaret gripped her mother's hand so tightly Eleanor could feel the bones shifting. Okoro continued. Earlier today, I witnessed something that shook me to my core. A captain on this base publicly humiliated the woman who saved my life. He called her a fraud. He called her a thief. He demanded she remove the jacket her dying husband had given her as a final gift. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned, searching for Thornton, but he was nowhere to be seen. That captain is no longer present, Okoro said flatly. I trust the appropriate authorities will address his conduct. But I did not come up here to talk about him. I came up here to do something I should have done 40 years ago. He stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward Eleanor. The crowd parted before him like water before a ship's bow. When he reached her, he stopped. His weathered face was wet with tears. His hands trembled at his sides. Then, slowly and deliberately, he came to attention. His right hand rose to his brow in a salute so precise it could have been used as a training example. Ma'am, he said, his voice breaking, on behalf of the 200 sailors of the USS Hartford, on behalf of our families, on behalf of everyone whose life exists because of your sacrifice, thank you. Eleanor stared at him, overwhelmed. She had never expected recognition. She had never wanted it. She had spent 40 years believing she deserved nothing but the shadows. But Okoro held the salute. And then, one by one, other veterans in the audience rose to their feet. Gray-haired men in worn service caps. Middle-aged women with medals on their chests. Young sailors in dress uniforms who had heard the story and understood its weight. They all saluted. The gesture spread through the crowd like a wave. Not everyone was military, but those who were stood at attention. Those who were not stood anyway, paying respect in the only way they knew how. Eleanor's children stood on either side of her, tears streaming down their faces, watching their mother receive the recognition she had never sought and never believed she deserved. Chin approached, her own eyes wet. Mrs. Vasquez, she said softly, I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to know that my program is available to you whenever you are ready. No paperwork, no bureaucracy, just support. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. Daniel leaned close to his mother's ear. Mom, he said, his voice thick. Elena is at home. Your granddaughter. She has been asking about you her whole life. We showed her pictures of you and Dad. She knows your face. Eleanor's composure finally broke completely. She had seen photographs of Elena, clipped from newsletters and glimpsed through windows. But she had never heard the child's voice, never held her hand, never told her stories about the grandfather who had died before she was born. She wants to meet you, Daniel continued. If you are ready. Eleanor looked at her son, then at her daughter, then at the crowd of strangers who had become witnesses to the most profound moment of her life. I am ready, she whispered. I have been ready for 30 years. Margaret laughed through her tears. Then let's go home, Mom. Let's finally take you home. The word hit Eleanor like a physical force. Home. She had not had a home in 3 decades. She had not believed she deserved one. But her daughter's hand was warm in hers. Her son's arm was solid around her shoulders. And somewhere across town, a granddaughter was waiting to meet the grandmother she had only known through photographs. The compass had finally found its way home. 6 weeks later, Eleanor stood in Margaret's garden, watching the sun set over the bay. The jacket hung in a place of honor in the living room now, preserved behind glass, no longer needed for warmth. She wore a soft sweater her daughter had bought her, the first new clothing she had owned in years. The transition had not been easy. 30 years of sleeping in shelters and under bridges had left marks that could not be erased in weeks. She still woke before dawn, still flinched at unexpected sounds, still sometimes forgot that the bed she slept in would be there the next night and the night after that. But she was learning. Slowly, painfully, beautifully, she was learning to live again. Elena burst through the back door, her 80-year-old energy barely contained. Grandma Ellie, come see what I made. Eleanor turned, and a smile that crossed her face was still a surprise to her. She had not smiled much in the years of hiding. Now she found herself smiling at the smallest things. A cup of coffee made by her daughter. A phone call from her son. A grandchild who had accepted her without question or hesitation, who had simply looked at her that first day and said, I knew you would come back. I told Daddy you would. She followed Elena into the house, where a sheet of paper covered in crayon awaited her on the kitchen table. The drawing showed 3 figures holding hands, a small one with wild curly hair, a medium one with gray hair and a big smile, and a tall one labeled Grandpa Marcus in careful letters. "That is you and me and Grandpa in heaven," Elena explained. "Daddy said Grandpa watches over us, so I drew him watching with us." Eleanor's throat tightened. She knelt down to Elena's level, studying the drawing with the seriousness it deserved. "It is beautiful, sweetheart. Grandpa would have loved it. Elena Benget. I'm going to make one for every room, so he can watch us everywhere." Margaret appeared in the doorway, watching the exchange with tears in her eyes. She had cried a lot in the past 6 weeks. They all had, but the tears had shifted from grief to something else, something that felt like healing. "Mom," Margaret said softly. "Commander Chin called. She wants to know if you are still coming to the group session tomorrow." Eleanor nodded, rising from her crouch with a small wince. Her body was not as forgiving as it once was. "Tell her I will be there." The group sessions had started 2 weeks ago. Chin's reintegration program brought together veterans who had struggled with the transition back to civilian life. Eleanor had been reluctant at first, unsure what she had to offer people decades younger than herself. But she had found her voice. She had found that her story, the classified operations, and the breakdown and the 30 years of hiding, resonated with others who felt lost in the margins. She had found that speaking the truth, after so many years of silence, was its own form of healing. Her first words in group had been halting. "My name is Eleanor. My call sign was Compass. And I lost 40 years because I could not forgive myself for surviving." The silence that followed had been heavy with recognition. Others nodded. Others understood. Others had carried similar weight. Now she went every week. She listened to their stories. She shared her own. She offered what wisdom she had gathered from decades of wandering, and she accepted their support in return. Daniel arrived with his wife Sarah for their weekly dinner, and the house filled with the noise of family. Conversations overlapping, laughter rising and falling. Elena demanding that everyone see her new drawing before they could eat. Eleanor sat at the table surrounded by people who loved her, eating food prepared by her daughter, watching her granddaughter charm everyone in the room, and felt something she had not felt in so long she had forgotten its name. Peace. After dinner, she slipped outside to the garden again. The stars were emerging now, pinpricks of light against the darkening sky. She had always loved the stars. Marcus had taught her to navigate by them in the years before GPS made such skills obsolete. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Daniel approaching with 2 cups of tea. He handed her one and stood beside her, looking up at the same stars. "Mom," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something." Eleanor waited. "All those years you're watching us. All those times you came to ceremonies and graduations and events." He paused. "Were you ever going to approach us? If that captain had not made a scene, if your name had not been read, would you ever have come forward?" Eleanor considered the question. It deserved an honest answer. "I do not know," she admitted. "I had convinced myself that watching was enough, that being close without being known was all I deserved." She sipped her tea. "I think I might have watched forever." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand. "I am glad you did not have to. I am glad that captain was such a fool." Eleanor laughed softly. "I never thought I would be grateful for cruelty. But if he had not confronted me, if Okoro had not recognized me, I might still be standing in shadows." "You're done with shadows," Daniel said firmly. "From now on, you stand in the light." Eleanor squeezed his hand. The stars wheeled overhead, the same star she had navigated by in a dozen countries, on a dozen operations, in a life that seemed to belong to someone else now. "Still here, Marcus." She whispered the words so softly Daniel could not hear. "Still trying, but not alone anymore. Never alone again." If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible, that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember, every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. Thank you for watching. The compass had wandered for 40 years, through grief and guilt and shadows that seemed to have no end. But compasses are made to find their way home. And Eleanor Vasquez, after all those years of searching, had finally found hers. Not in a place, not in a memory, but in the arms of the children who had never stopped loving her, even when they did not know she was alive. In the laughter of a granddaughter who drew pictures of heaven, in the stars that still guided her, just as they always had. Home was not where you started. Home was where you finally stopped running. And Eleanor had stopped running at last.